hi, everybody, and welcome to the fifth podcast in our second season, which accompanies Mike Dunlop's new book, The Art of the Turnaround, which, by the way, is published on the 9th of September. Now, as you'll have known, we've already examined the importance of mentorship when it comes to reviving a failing company, a failing business. Now, today, we're going to look at another really key pillar in Mike's turnaround plan, and it's a fascinating one, namely the elimination of constraints. Briefly, Mike, what sort of constraints are you talking about here?
Well, a number of different constraints, mainly financial. People feel that it's difficult to raise money, that they can't do this because of that. And particularly in a turnaround situation, you feel a lot of people feel they have constraints, so they can't do things. And the purpose of eliminating the constraints is to open up all the capabilities that people have and not let them really be in a position where they're restricting their capabilities.
Right. So some constraints are real, some are perceived, and I think that's your real bugbear, isn't it? Can you give me an example of a perceived constraint that you've encountered in a turnaround?
Not being qualified to do a job.
People just not believing in themselves.
Yeah, well, they've been told that to do that, you have to be qualified, and therefore you can't do it if you're not. That is not true. I mean, this is the whole history of people teaching themselves. All the great philosophers who believed in the autodidactic process, that you have the ability to teach yourself. And that eliminates a lot of the constraints that people feel they have because they haven't got the formalized education, and therefore they feel that they are excluded from a number of opportunities.
Now, the elimination of constraints, is not a new term. I know that there's this management philosophy called the theory of constraints, and I think it was developed by a guy called Eliyahu Goldratt back in 1984. He was a management guru, and he talks about 5 steps to eliminate those constraints, starting by identifying the constraint and so on. Do you draw your philosophy from that treatise, or is this pillar drawn purely from your experience?
No, I did read the book, The Goal, and it's very interesting because you remove constraints in one place and all they do is move somewhere else. And then you have to get to eliminate the constraints there because you've created another constraint elsewhere. So the basic philosophy is very similar, but it's more a confidence building that people have infinitely more capability than they think they have. And a lot of that is constrained by third parties who tell them they're not qualified, they're not old enough, there's something wrong with them, and therefore they cannot do it. And I've found that within companies, I found extraordinary gems and capabilities of people who wouldn't have thought for 1 second that they were capable of doing the job that they did, and not only capable, but did it extraordinarily well.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. I mean, when it comes to the company, obviously there are so many constraints, aren't there? There's physical constraints, there's managerial constraints, outside constraints, beyond the company. Then there are these, and you touched on it, these self-imposed constraints. I guess from obviously the employees. Can you give an example of an employee you've come across where you thought, I'm going to liberate this man or this woman from their constraints, as it were?
Well, this was probably the Belgian company that I bought, where I had the wonderful lady Miriam, who sat at the end of the room where I had a glass desk. And when I asked a question of one of the senior management, I could see it ricocheted down the entire, all the desks in that room, and probably 4 or 5 stops. And it ended with Miriam. And Miriam went onto the computer. It was sort of early days for computers, came up with the answer, and then I saw from my glass office it ricocheted back. So then I asked another question, and I saw it go all the way down to Miriam. And then I asked Miriam to come to my office. And I said, Miriam, apparently you have all the answers, because everybody goes to you and you go onto the computer and you find the answers. I don't need anybody in the middle. You're now going to be the plant manager, and you have all the answers in terms of what the production requirements are, because you know how to use the computer, and everybody comes to you to ask. So I'm cut out all the middlemen
So what's the constraint there? Because she can clearly do her job. Where's the constraint?
because she wasn't given an opportunity to run the plant shop floor because she was a woman, because she was 24, and she was the low person on the totem pole. She had a clerical position, and she never thought in her wildest dreams that she would have the opportunity to run the plant, basically, run the production.
Right. So that constraint is driven by the management or by the culture of the company, I guess.
A combination. I
Mm.
mean, her viewpoint of where she thought she was, the people she reported to, the hierarchical structure, they all made sure everybody stayed in their box. And therefore, that was a very firm constraint on what they could do. It was when I observed where the information was coming from and tripled her pay that it created quite a stir within the company.
Yeah, I bet that can be quite liberating, can't it?
Oh, yes, it just changes all the rules. And we didn't have a late production one single month. We hadn't had anything on time for 9 years. And within a month, everything was going out on time.
And how common is that?
Uh, Almost all the companies I was involved in turning around, I found one or two gems. They're normally hidden deep in the organization, totally at the wrong level. And they believe that that's their job, that they are not qualified or they haven't been asked to do anything else. So they've actually constrained their own future going forward.
You know, I wonder, do they find a curious refuge in their constraints? Because it can be quite seductive. I can't do that. I best leave alone. And that can be quite seductive, can't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is a great sort of success in staying hidden. I mean, bureaucrats do it the entire time. I mean,
Mm.
they're impossible to find out who actually the person is, and we see the classic case of that when someone says Boeing is not happy um, with your work. Well, Boeing doesn't actually exist. It's a name given to a group of people who choose to work together. So, who was the person in Boeing that wasn't happy? I'd like to talk to them. So, people actually devolve into this sort of third party, and that even protects them even more because they know that Boeing doesn't exist. So, Boeing is never going to be questioned, or whoever the company may be.
Well, so why are these people who are constrained so compliant? Almost like the Stockholm syndrome, or is that pushing it a bit?
No, I think it is. I think it's exactly a Stockholm syndrome. I mean, they don't look at the opportunities as being theirs. It's a permission based. If they're given permission, then they will do it. If they're promoted but they don't feel that they're really in control of their own destiny, and that they have to wait until they've got approval.
Are there more constraints in the bigger companies because people can just squirrel away and hide in dark corners?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the really, really big companies, I believe if you walk around with a clipboard for a couple of years, no one will question actually what you do. So I think there is this massive ability to be completely anonymous. Small companies are more under the microscope. Everybody you can see them, you can meet with them. And so there's less opportunity to hide. But within those companies, there are frequently silos.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
the silos are, this is the financial department. No one should know anything about it but us. If you need any financial information, you come to us.
And how,
And so there is these sort of mini silos in companies.
and so when you turn around a company and you get them all together, how do you break them out of those silos so they can see each other's constraints?
That's a very interesting question. And the meetings really are a key element. First, you make sure in the meeting that no one has their supervisor in it
Mm.
because you don't want them to worry about anything they're saying.
Because they'll be constrained by seeing their supervisor in front of them. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, they just don't want to say anything negative.
So true.
And so when you get the whole group together and you're mixing different departments, what I've seen is a greater appreciation for what other people do. And it has this sort of miraculous impact when someone says, well, I've got a problem here. And the other person says, well, yeah, but when your problem gets to me, it's even worse. And this is what I have to do. So you kind of open up the visibility of the entire company. And in some cases, people have never met the people in the room. I mean, the financial department has never been down to the warehouse,
Oh dear.
and this department has never been there. And so it's almost an introduction. And one of the things we do is we only have sort of 15 to 20 in the meetings, and we have people introduce themselves. And so it's quite an extraordinary sort of revelation where even during the meeting process, people are meeting people for the first time.
That must be quite a dynamic scene, really.
Yeah, and it's the positive is that people see other people's hardships
Yeah.
and all the problems that they have, and they realize in some cases they're causing them.
Yeah, I guess that could
So
turn into a massive moan fest, though, couldn't
we don't allow that.
it?
It's we try and make it as positive as possible, and yes, there are always people moaning, and we let them get their gripe out. And now what? And so we sort of keep a real good pace, and we really force a positive by one of the requirements of coming to the meeting is that they have a suggestion of something that can improve the company or improve their own work space, and they're required to come to the meeting with that. So the first thing we go around the room and listen to people's suggestions.
We're talking about individuals here, but I kind of feel we're dancing around the elephant in the room here, which is the company itself will say, you know what, our biggest constraint is financial. We just don't have the money. And how on earth do you surmount that if the bank says go away?
Well, there are a number of different ways. One is you can get money. You can get loans. You can restructure the company. Almost every one of them I restructured to make it more palatable to the bank.
Well, wouldn't they have done that by
And
now?
the bank wanted to get its money back. So it was almost always flexible, and I'd come from the bank. But I had to make sure that there was sufficient cash flow to support any changes that were made.
Some constraints, though, just cannot be surmounted. You keep on talking about the elimination of constraints. What about those constraints which are beyond the company? Yes, I take your point on the financial, that there are workarounds, but what about employment law? You can't surmount employment law. It is just there.
No, obviously, you can't. There are some things you can't, but you can certainly work around them.
Right.
Would still be totally within the law. And if you have to lay off people, you obviously have to be fair and not discriminate. And that's obviously a key part of it. But there are a lot less than people think. And frequently the laws are used as an alibi for not doing something. We can't do it because of that. Well, no one's been creative. No one's really looked at it. And unfortunately, the worst department you can come up with is the HR department. They tell you all the things you cannot do and how complicated employment law is and how you have to watch out for this. You get sued for that. And you do that. So what it creates is a complete sort of static situation in a company because the HR department was told you can't do anything. Well, if you don't, then we're all going to go under. And so you have to. And you have to take some risks sometimes. You have to say, okay, I understand that that's a potential risk, but I'm going to take it anyway.
You spoke
because I have to.
Yeah, you spoke about Miriam and that micro constraint is a word that applied to her. Can you give me an example of a company which was constrained and was somehow liberated from that constraint in all your turnarounds?
I think probably again back to the Belgium company where I had two unions, a Protestant and a Catholic union. And the company was split right in the middle between the Protestant and the Catholic union. And the twain would meet. And the Catholic union was for the French and the Spanish, and the Protestant union was for the Flemish and the Dutch. And so we had two unions, and they hated each other and they despised me. So that was not a very good starting point. But we managed to get it resolved. I think you'll see in the book the story about the Petrus bribe, where I took them both out to dinner and allowed them to buy the most expensive wine on the list, which I think was a 72 Petrus.
Well, allow them to
And
choose the wine, not buy it.
I allowed them to choose the wine. I
Right.
said, if we get nothing out of this meeting at all, you will have sampled the best wine that's available in this restaurant. That's the worst that can come from
It's
it.
the only thing they've got in
And
common, yeah.
well, and they worked backwards and forwards whether 58 was better than 62 or 62 was better than 72. And eventually they came to an agreement and we ordered the wine. And of course, this even in those days, I think it was about $2,000 for a bottle. And so the whole restaurant stopped. The maitre d' came out. The sommelier came out. It made it just a massive performance of decanting this wine. All the pauses, but it was tasted, and all the eyes looking up. And but I said to them, "Look, you haven't agreed on anything, but tonight you've at least agreed on the wine." And so we ordered a second bottle, probably one of the most expensive dinners I've ever had.
Oh my goodness.
Towards the end, everybody said, both of them said, "I think we can work with you."
What?
I said, "Well, it's not going to be 2 bottles of Petrus every time." They said, "No, this is just an exception."
Well, we can work with you
So,
until we've sobered up.
no, they were both enormously helpful when they saw what my mission was. And one of the things that we did was significantly increase the wages on the shop floor, and way above the union rate. And they said, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "I want to make it virtually impossible for our competitors, because we're going to be very efficient and we can afford those wages. You will then take our wages to these other companies and saying, 'Look what they're paying.' So that'll give you massive leverage in terms of your negotiation with your union members." And they laughed. They thought that was the funniest thing. They just thought the whole sort of Machiavellian process was just too amusing. And they became very strong allies, and we became actually good friends.
That's a great story. I have to say, constraints aren't a fixed target, are they, Mike? Because constraints morph and evolve. So you're trying to nail jelly to a wall in some respects, I guess.
Yeah, but also once they're solved, it does open up other constraints.
Exactly.
But you probably wouldn't have seen those other constraints if you hadn't eliminated the one in front. So you get a whole different vista, a whole different view, and it's extraordinary fun. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of fun to eliminate a constraint that everybody agreed was insurmountable. And the one with the union, everybody said, "No way can you get those people to talk to each other." Well, I made a reservation of the best restaurant in Liège, and they both joined me, somewhat reluctantly. And so that was a constraint, that the two unions wouldn't talk to each other.
So you solved a tribal constraint, I guess, there. I mean, I have to say, you make constraints sound like shackles that you have to be freed from. I mean, constraints aren't all bad, are they? Isn't it good to have some constraints in place to, I don't know, rein in employees who are not taking the firm to a good place, or bringing forward projects that are just going to end in tears?
I'm not so worried, and I never found that the freedom led to anarchy. I think that's a great way of controlling people, by fearing that if you let them do what they wanted to do, the sky is going to come crashing down. There'll be anarchy. And what I've found is people are people. And if they're motivated, and if they see the benefit to themselves and the benefit to the company and the benefit to their family, you have to promote the vision. You can't be top down, but you discuss it with people what they want.
So when
You know,
you go to companies, what are the big constraints that you keep coming across time and time again?
well, there are obviously financial constraints,
Exactly.
otherwise I wouldn't be
Sure.
there, but they're frequently unnecessary organizational structures. There are necessary silos. No one really knows what the other one does. Frequently, the person who's running the company, the owner, is not good with the financials. So the financial department won't share with him or her everything that's going on. So it is a systematic breaking down of the walls and sharing with everybody. I mean, when in the first meetings, I share with them the financial situation of the company. This is where we're at, guys. And these are the problems, and this is what we've got to solve. So, for the first time, information is being shared with them that they can comprehend.
Did
Before that, they were in the dark.
did they come away from this with the sort of scales falling from their eyes, thinking, "My gosh, there were constraints I never knew were constraints"?
Well, or that when the constraints are removed, they become advocates for
Yeah.
eliminating other constraints. I mean, there is a great liberating factor of once you have opened up everything about the company and it's not secretive and they know everything, then they can't claim they don't know.
And
And so it is a reveal, and I really enjoy it. I mean, those early meetings were probably the most satisfying part of the job. Number one, you were assessing people. You listened to what they thought were constraints. You eliminated a lot of them just right there and then. Some took a little bit longer, but you create a whole different atmosphere and a momentum going forward. Constraints stop movement.
can you elaborate on that?
Well, if you're constrained, you're not going to put any energy into something if you know you're going to be so restricted, you're not going to be able to do it.
How big a deal?
So removing constraints changes the optimism, the energy level, the drive, the focus, the creativity that has all been sitting there dormant while the constraint has been there.
Is that one of the biggest stumbling blocks with a failing company, constraints? Because there are so many factors that play into it.
I think it's just the overall morale. People don't know what's happening. People always think the worst. So I think just opening up when you listen to what they perceive as a constraint and you eliminate it, you've opened up the box and let the light in.
I've seen companies where I've looked at employees and I've thought the constraint is you being a part of this company. Now, I've read in your book that you talk about Marines and naysayers. Some of those constraints are personnel, and you need to actually lose those personnel, put it that way, to get rid of those constraints, eliminate them from the workforce, to put it brutally.
Yeah, they are the constraint.
Yeah.
I mean, they will tell everybody how bad things are, how they're going to get worse. And if there's no semblance of modifying their comments and the behaviors in the meeting, I just put a cross by their name. Just say, nope, they're not going to be part of the team. You have to have a team going forward. You have to have the confidence, and you also can't have the negative group that impacts the group in the middle, as we explain in the books, the Marines, and then the 20% Marines, 60% in the middle, and the 20% outright terrorists. And so the industrial terrorists, you've got to identify, and they can be some of the nicest people. They can be very deceptive. They can agree with everything that you're planning on doing, but you know they're going to undermine it. And so you've got to identify them, you've got to remove them. And they're normally not happy. They are very, very corrosive. They want the rest of the group in the middle, the 60%, to join their camp and not be Marines. So it's hard enough to get the middle group to become Marines. But if they have a group permanently pulling them down and explaining that this is just nothing as a way of just trying to get more out of them and pay them less and make them work harder, you can't really run a company with a group like that.
So that's a clear case where you literally do eliminate the constraints from the company. I should imagine
Yes.
when you do this, you have to be pretty counter-revolutionary, don't you?
You have to move quickly. The fastest way that you can undermine adversaries is to move quickly and to pivot and move with absolute purpose, where there's not a single one iota of doubt where you're going. There's no option B. And you have to do it in a very forceful and direct way. And it's amazing how many people want to join that bandwagon.
Just as we wind this up, Mike, there are so many steps to turning around a company. Well, 10 in your book. Whereabouts are the elimination of constraints in that 10-step turnaround?
I think it's fairly high up,
Yeah.
and it really applies to almost all the steps. You have to constantly look at what is holding the company back, what is a real constraint, as you've pointed out, or what is a restraint that can be modified, or a constraint that can be eliminated entirely. So you basically start with a blank sheet of paper, make no assumptions whatsoever, and try. And you only learn to eliminate constraints by trying. And I think just a very quick example: when I first built my first major manufacturing group, I was told that we could not get financing for the company, and I had about 300,000 in the bank. And we actually needed a lot more than that to build the company up. We're doing about $1 million in sales. And so we applied for a loan, we put a package together, and we submitted it to a bank, and they turned us down. And obvious constraint. So the person I was working with said, why don't we ask them why they turned us down, and then put that into the proposal and submit it to the next bank? So every bank that turns us down, the proposal gets better and better because we're answering their objections. Well, we didn't quite realize how long the journey was going to be, but the 30th bank did approve the loan. Sheer luck, the president of the bank did a once-a-month call on companies.
Sorry, seriously, the 30th attempt.
The 30th attempt. And I thought the proposal was so good at that point, I would have lent myself the money. It was just incredible proposal. Answered every possible concern that a bank would have. And so the president of this bank, Norwest Business Credit from Minnesota of all places, and this was Portland, Oregon. He flew out there, and we had an empty warehouse. We had the offices had been built. And after 10 minutes of sitting in a meeting with a bunch of earnest MBAs doing their due diligence, he said, Mike, show me the plant. And I went out there and I showed him the drawings of where all the machines were going to go, the vision that I had. He came back into the meeting and said, Mike's staying at the Benson Hotel in Portland. Have dinner with him tonight. I want a proposal on my desk tomorrow morning. And he said, by the way, I think you need 8.2 million, and as an absolute guaranteed line. But he said, I think you'll need a little bit more, so I'll put in a high interest $2 million mezzanine line. So we were borrowing $10.8 million. And he then said, if your vision comes to pass, like I think it will do, you will be refinancing us in a couple of years. So he told his people not to include prepayment penalties. And he said this has been the best sales trip he's been on all year. And he said, take me back to the airport. I can catch an early flight back to Minnesota. So I've got what's called the tombstone. It's not a tombstone because someone's dead, but they're called financial tombstones. And it sits on my desk all the time to remind me that there are things that you can do that normal people would consider a constraint. But if you really look to eliminate the constraints, as we did with the 30 different proposals, sometimes magic can happen.
Is there any constraint that cannot be eliminated or overcome? There must be some. There are some.
Yes.
Like what?
Death.
And taxes.
Death and taxes. Well, taxes you can find some ways around, but death you can't.
There's no workaround there.
There's no workaround there. But
right. Well, on that rather final note,
no, it's just that I think there are a lot less than people perceive. Obviously, there are constraints, but what I've found is there are a lot less than people think. And once you start to remove them, you create a whole new energy level and excitement. And that's kind of what your job is.
And what is amazing about this is not just the nous of turning around a company, it's the psychology. That is what is so interesting, the psychology of people when you turn a company around.
Yeah, and how quickly they come on board. And this is why early successes are really important. So you have to get some early successes. You get the entire company together and say, look what we've done. And then in many of the companies, I brought a brand new piece of equipment in every month. And I've stopped the entire factory. We would have the equipment brought in, and I'd explain why we bought it, how much it costs, and what it was going to do, and how it was going to impact our future. So you create this sort of expectation of something good that's going to happen. We're going to the circus, we're going to have ice cream. Here's your ice cream. And you find people really are thrilled to have a direction, a vision, and a future.
Well, that's a nice segue into our next podcast, because another central pillar of turning around a company, of course, and one that really, I think, leans very heavily into the elimination of constraints, and one which we're going to have to save for the next podcast, and that is the pursuit of happiness. I think it was first coined by a 17th century British philosopher, John Locke, and it is critical in company turnarounds as it is, I guess, in life. But now that's for next time. But for now, Mike, thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot, Alex.
Thank you for listening to The Art of the Turnaround. If you love this podcast, please like and subscribe. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok at The Art of the Turnaround. You can follow Mike Dunlop on LinkedIn or his website, theartoftheturnaround.com. This podcast was produced by Cadence 3 Studios. I'm your host and story editor, Alex Dunlop. April Bricker is our executive producer. Burke Tobenek is our producer and editor, additional editing by Eric Scheel. The show art was designed by Todd Arbuckle. Andrew Kindred is our sound engineer, and Eric Munch is our audio mixer. The Art of the Turnaround is based on the book by Mike Dunlop.